Lisa didn't immediately notice how Josh had become an integral part of her life again. It all started gradually, as it usually happens with those changes that turn out to be the most significant. At first, a couple of innocent messages, as if he had returned to their city not to change her fate, but just happened to be nearby. Josh wrote with a familiar ease that she hadn't felt for a long time, either in her relationship with Mark or in her life at all. These messages had nothing to do with the tension she was used to experiencing. They were simple questions about how she was doing, what was new in her life, how her day was going. When he first appeared on the doorstep of their apartment after a long time, Lisa was almost shocked by how easily they began to talk, as if the years that separated them were just an illusion. Josh stood in the doorway with the casual smile she remembered from childhood. Tall, athletic, with dark eyes that sparkled with fun, Josh was always the one who brought lightness and joy to her life. Even now, in this adult world where things had become much more complicated, his presence had the same effect on her. Lisa felt her body relax as she began to smile and laugh, even if she did not understand why. He began to appear more often. At first every few weeks, then every week, and then almost every other day. Mark didn't seem to mind. She and Josh weren't as close as Josh and Lisa, but her husband didn't see anything wrong with that. To him, Josh was just an old friend, a buddy with whom you could chat about football or cars while Lisa cooked dinner. And perhaps that was what made Lisa uneasy. It was all happening too easily, too serenely. She expected some kind of internal resistance, a sense of guilt, or at least a hint that it was all wrong. But on the contrary, every visit from Josh brought her relief. These meetings became a kind of outlet for her. When Mark was busy at work or tired after another day, immersed in business and problems at the construction site, Josh could sit next to her on the couch and discuss everything from old school friends to the simplest everyday issues. Lisa noticed how her mood changed in his presence. She no longer felt trapped in a routine from which there was no escape. Everything seemed easier with Josh. Even the most difficult problems that she discussed with him did not cause her the same emotions that arose in conversations with her husband. They had no complaints, reproaches, or tedious explanations. Lisa felt like herself again, the girl she was before marriage, before all these responsibilities and disappointments. Over time, Josh began to spend more time with them. He started staying overnight when his job required him to be in town for a few days. Mark, who was always busy with his own affairs, took it quite calmly. Perhaps he was even glad that Lisa was not alone in his absence. But Lisa felt more and more that something was accumulating in her heart that she should have suppressed. Something too familiar, but at the same time frightening. On one of those nights when Josh stayed with them again, Lisa woke up in the middle of the night from some strange feeling. Her heart was beating a little faster than usual. She couldn't figure out what exactly caused this concern. Maybe it was the sound from outside, or maybe it was the fact that Josh was sleeping in the next room. But anyway, she couldn't sleep anymore. Lying next to Mark, she felt his presence like a weight. She looked at his profile in the dim light of the bedroom and thought that their life had become so predictable that even this calm breathing next to her no longer brought comfort as before. Mark rolled over in his sleep, making a soft snore that Lisa had long been used to. She sat up in bed with her feet on the floor and reached for a bottle of water on the bedside table. The thirst wasn't that strong, but she wanted to distract herself from the thoughts that were bothering her. After taking a few sips, Lisa got up and headed to the kitchen, deciding that a glass of water would help her calm down a little and fall asleep again. But as she walked through the living room, she noticed a silhouette on the couch. Josh was awake. He was sitting with his back pressed against the pillow, and as it seemed to her, he was thinking about something of his own. Her footsteps seemed to attract his attention, and he turned his head slightly in her direction. Lisa felt her heart begin to beat faster again. She couldn't understand why every time he looked at her, her thoughts became too confused. Maybe it was just fatigue. Perhaps her feelings were caused by the fact that their friendship had revived after a long break. But something told Lisa that it was much more difficult.
Can't you sleep either?
Josh smiled slightly, and that smile made something inside her flutter. He looked calm, but his eyes were twinkling with a strange gleam.
It looks like that. It's strange, I usually sleep like a dead man.
They fell silent. Lisa, standing in the doorway of the living room, felt the air between them become somehow thick, filled with something that she could not name. Josh continued to stare at her, and she suddenly felt her body react to his gaze. It was a barely noticeable tension, as if a spark had passed between them, which she tried her best not to notice. But now it has become impossible. She crossed the room and stood by the window. Looking at the dark silhouettes of houses behind the glass, Lisa tried to collect her thoughts, although she realized that she was doing this only to avoid meeting his gaze. She felt that if she looked at Josh now, everything would change. Their friendship, which they have so carefully maintained all these years, will be in jeopardy. But it was inevitable. Lisa understood that something had changed between them, and this feeling grew with each of his visits. She could no longer ignore the fact that she was attracted to him. And it wasn't just nostalgia for childhood, not just a desire to return to the days when everything was simpler. It was something deeper, something she was afraid to admit.
You know, Liz, I'm glad I came back here. I haven't felt so calm in a long time.
He said it softly, almost in a whisper, but the words stung her. Calmly? Did he feel calm? Lisa, on the contrary, could not find a place for herself. She was trying to figure out how she could stay so calm when a whole hurricane of emotions was raging inside her.
Yes, it's really quiet here. Perhaps too much.
She couldn't stand being around him anymore. The tension had become too much, and she didn't know how to deal with it. Lisa quickly returned to the bedroom, hoping that Mark was still asleep. She lay down next to him, feeling exhausted. Thoughts of Josh were running through her head, of how much everything had changed since his return. And although Lisa tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary embarrassment, she knew the truth. There was no longer just friendship between them. She couldn't ignore her feelings anymore, and no matter how much she wanted to return to the simple life she had, everything had already changed. Lisa spent the next few days in a state of confusion. Josh was coming again, and each visit only exacerbated her inattention. She couldn't act the way she used to with him anymore. Their conversations were full of innuendo, and every time he left, Lisa felt devastated. But at the same time, she was looking forward to his return. It was crazy, but there was nothing she could do about it. Mark, as usual, was immersed in his own affairs and did not seem to notice anything. He was still kind to Lisa, but more and more often she found herself no longer having the same feelings for him that she had before. Every touch of his aroused in her not warmth, but some kind of strange disgust. Lisa tried to convince herself that this was just a temporary crisis, that everything would get better soon. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. Lisa always knew that her connection with Josh was special. Since childhood, they have felt each other like two people who do not need many words between them. They could be silent, but still understand each other. It was this ease of communication that was what she lacked in her relationship with Mark right now. In the early years of marriage, she tried not to think about it, finding solace in the fact that every marriage undergoes changes over time. But everything has changed since Josh returned to their city. At first, she tried to suppress the feeling that was growing inside her, explaining it with nostalgia for the past. But gradually this feeling took over her head. Lisa could no longer ignore the wave of emotions that was growing with every day she spent with Josh. His frequent visits, which at first seemed innocent, became for Lisa not just a source of joy from meeting an old friend, but something more. Every time Josh came, her heart started beating faster. She felt his gaze on her, but did not dare to meet his eyes for too long, fearing that he would read more in her gaze than she would like to show. At first, she attributed it to the usual feminine coquetry, to a slight infatuation which seemed to be harmless. Who hasn't felt sympathy for an old friend? Especially to someone who was always there for her, supported her, knew how to make her laugh and just knew her like no one else. But there was something more inside her that she tried to ignore. Lisa couldn't admit to herself that her feelings for Josh had long gone beyond simple friendship. All this time, Mark continued to remain in the background. He was immersed in his work, which increasingly distanced him from Lisa. The evenings spent together seemed routine to her, and the rare moments of intimacy were empty and mechanical. Mark seemed to have stopped noticing her, immersed in his own affairs. He was not interested in her thoughts, desires, her inner feelings. For him, she was still a wife with whom he could discuss everyday issues, but he stopped seeing her as a woman with whom he could talk about something deep, real. It was different with Josh. With him, she could discuss everything from childhood memories to difficult questions that troubled her soul. And it was this difference that gradually drove Mark out of her thoughts, although Lisa was still trying to cling to the familiar picture of their marriage. But the real shake-up happened one of those days when Mark went on a business trip for a couple of days again. Josh stopped by her place in the evening just to chat, as he had done many times before. Lisa remembered them sitting on the couch, discussing something light and completely insignificant, but her thoughts were far away. She noticed Josh lightly touching her shoulder as he laughed at some joke. This touch was fleeting, but it left behind a strange feeling. Something inside her flared up like a spark, and at that moment Lisa realized that she could no longer deceive herself. Every day it became more difficult for her to suppress these feelings. She began to find herself waiting for his calls and messages, that her day seemed incomplete if she hadn't heard at least a few words from Josh. She stopped enjoying the moments when she was alone with Mark, and even their weekends together began to seem like a painful duty that did not bring any pleasure. She could no longer pretend that their marriage brought her joy. The moment of realization that her feelings for Josh were more than just friendship came unexpectedly, although it was natural. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, Lisa decided to go for a walk in the park. She took her phone with her and at some point, almost without realizing it, dialed Josh's number. She wanted to talk to him, to hear his voice. This time she didn't have any specific topic to talk about. It was just necessary to talk to him. They met at the lake. Josh was in his usual outfit: jeans, sneakers, a light jacket, as if he was ready for another trip to the gym or for a jog. Lisa, on the other hand, felt vulnerable. She had come to this meeting on a spontaneous impulse and now did not know what to say. But Josh, as always, found something to lighten the atmosphere. He made a few jokes, and the tension began to subside. They were walking along the lake, discussing old school days, when suddenly the silence hung between them, from which there was no escape. Lisa stopped. The wind blew her hair slightly, and she stared at the water, trying to find answers to the questions that were swarming in her head. Josh stopped beside her too, and Lisa felt his gaze on her. She knew she had to say something, that this moment couldn't just pass by, but the words stuck in her throat.
Liz, you know you can tell me anything. I'm always here for you.
His voice was quiet, and there was so much warmth and sincerity in it that Lisa caught her breath for a moment. She turned to him, and in his eyes she read what she was afraid of. He knew. He understood what was going on, but he was waiting for her to admit it herself.
Josh,
She couldn't finish the sentence. At that moment, a chasm opened up between them. They were on the verge of something inevitable, and Lisa knew that if she took one more step, everything would change. But this step was almost done. She realized that she had been feeling something more than just friendly sympathy for him for a long time, and Josh knew it. They both knew. A few seconds seemed like an eternity. Josh didn't move, but there was something in his gaze that said more than any words. He was ready for this step, ready for everything to change. But he was waiting for her decision. Lisa suddenly felt the ground become shaky under her feet. She couldn't believe that she had gone so far as to let her feelings get out of control. She wanted to return to a life where everything was simpler, where she could ignore her inner feelings. But now it was impossible. She turned away, looking at the lake, which reflected the sunset sky. Conflicting feelings were fighting inside her. She wanted to hug Josh, tell him everything that had boiled over the months, but at the same time she knew that this moment would destroy everything that she and Mark had built for so many years. She couldn't afford it, couldn't betray the one who had been with her all these years. But thoughts of Mark became more and more blurred, as if his presence in her life was becoming something ghostly. He was her husband, but he had not been the one she loved for a long time. And this realization was another blow for her.
Josh, I can't go on like this. It's so complicated.
Her voice was low, almost a whisper. She wasn't just talking to Josh, she was talking to herself. Difficult. Yes, everything has become too complicated. Her marriage, her life, her feelings, everything was confused, and she no longer knew how to get out of this maze. Josh took a step closer, and his hand almost touched her shoulder, but he stopped. He was always the one who understood her better than anyone else. He knew that Lisa wasn't ready yet. He knew that she had to make this decision on her own.
I don't want to complicate anything. You know I'll always be there for you, Liz.
These words, spoken with such simplicity and warmth, were both a comfort and a blow. Lisa realized that it had been a long time since she had felt such understanding from the outside. Stamp. He was with her physically, but not emotionally. He didn't notice what was going on inside her, didn't hear her words. But Josh did. They continued to stand side by side, silently, but everything between them became too obvious. Lisa could no longer deny that her feelings for Josh had long crossed the boundaries of friendship. But with that came the realization that her life would never be the same again. She couldn't keep pretending that nothing was happening anymore. The day after this meeting, Lisa sat alone for a long time, thinking about what had happened. She couldn't get rid of the image of Josh, of his words, of the way he looked at her. Her feelings for him left her no choice anymore. Now she had to make a decision to continue living in this lie, or to take a step towards those feelings that she had suppressed for so long. Mark, as usual, returned home late. He was tired and, as always, showed no interest in how her day had gone. They sat in the kitchen in silence, and Lisa felt an invisible wall grow between them. Now that she has realized her feelings for Josh, her relationship with Mark has become even more painful. She knew she couldn't go on like this anymore. Her heart no longer belonged to her husband. When Lisa first realized that her feelings for Josh no longer fit into the framework of friendship, she tried to suppress them. At first it seemed possible just not to think about him, not to invite him into the house too often, to focus on Mark and their life together. But the more she tried to control herself, the stronger her desire became. The problem was that every time Josh was around, there was some kind of inexplicable tension between them. This feeling was like a spark that is ready to ignite everything around once it hits a dry tree. Lisa has been trying to convince herself for a long time that all this is just a temporary disturbance caused by a crisis in her marriage. She was trying to establish a relationship with Mark, as if strengthening her attempts to return to the feelings they had before. But each time her efforts were shattered by her husband's indifference, his eternal preoccupation and lack of emotional involvement in their relationship. She told herself that this was how it happened in long marriages, that passion gradually faded away, giving way to habit. But with Josh, it was different. She couldn't explain why his presence aroused such strong emotions in her that she hadn't felt in years. Everything changed that evening when Mark was delayed at work again. Lisa, as usual, spent the day alone, doing household chores and thinking about her feelings. She hadn't planned on inviting Josh to visit, but when he called and offered to come in, she couldn't refuse. Maybe deep down she already knew something was going to happen between them, but she didn't want to admit it to herself. Josh came in, as usual, wearing a light jacket and with that casual smile that always made Lisa feel better. They spent time sitting on the couch discussing some trivia. Josh, as always, joked easily, making her evening more relaxed than it would have been with Mark. But tension was growing inside Lisa. She felt drawn to him, but she couldn't allow herself to give in to that feeling. She was trying to stay calm, trying to act like her usual self. But every smile, every casual gesture, intensified her inner turmoil. When the evening came to an end, Lisa felt tired. Not physically, but emotionally, from the constant tension, from the fact that she could no longer cope with her own feelings. She invited Josh to stay the night, as he had done before when Mark was away. It seemed natural and familiar to her, and at the same time there was something forbidden in this sentence. At that moment she couldn't tell if she was doing it out of politeness or out of a desire to spend more time with him. Josh agreed, and they went together to the living room, where he usually slept on the couch. Lisa was going to say goodnight to him and go to the bedroom, but something made her stay. She couldn't leave. And their conversations, which usually lasted several hours, this time ended in mid-sentence. A silence hung between them, filled with expectation of something more. Lisa stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at him. She could feel her heart pounding faster, her body tensing from the fact that something inevitable was about to happen between them. Josh, sitting on the couch, was silent, but there was something in his gaze that Lisa had been trying to hide from herself all these months. He was also ready for this step. There was a tension in the air that was getting stronger by the second. Lisa could no longer pretend that everything was the same as before. The second she took a step forward, everything inside her turned upside down. It was an instant decision, not thought out and not rational. It was as if something inside her had finally broken down, and she had allowed herself to be led by her desires. There was silence in the room, broken only by their breathing. Lisa walked over to the couch, not fully understanding what she was doing. Everything was happening in a blur, her thoughts were clouded, and only her feelings remained. Josh looked at her without saying a word, but there was so much understanding in his gaze that Lisa felt her resistance completely disappear. She sank down next to him, feeling his warmth seep into her body. It was like a moment that both of them had been waiting for too long, and now they couldn't stop. Everything inside her screamed that this was a mistake, but she couldn't listen to that voice anymore. When their hands touched each other, Lisa felt as if her whole life beyond that moment had ceased to exist. In that second, she forgot about Mark, about her obligations, about what was right and what was wrong. All that mattered was here and now. That night was their first intimacy. Lisa felt her body respond to Josh's every touch, as her thoughts dissolved into this moment. It wasn't just physical intimacy, it was the union of two souls who had kept their distance for too long. Everything that had been between them had accumulated over these months, poured out at this moment. Their touch was gentle, but at the same time full of passion, which they had been trying to suppress for too long. When it was over, Lisa felt strangely empty. She lay next to Josh, listening to his breathing, and realized that now their lives would never be the same. She couldn't go back to what she was before. This moment changed everything that had happened between them, and there was no turning back. The next morning, Lisa woke up with a heavy feeling in her soul. Josh was still there, but now his presence was not as light and carefree as before. There was a silence between them that spoke more than any words. Lisa felt crushed by her own feelings. She was tormented by guilt in front of Mark, but at the same time she knew that she could no longer ignore her feelings for Josh. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was something deeper, something she couldn't explain even to herself. After that night, everything changed. Lisa could no longer look at Josh as just a friend. Every time they were together, she felt the tension between them re-emerge, which they both tried to suppress. Their friendship no longer existed. Instead, there was something new, something dangerous and exciting at the same time. The relationship with Mark has also changed. Lisa began to notice that her behavior with him had changed. She could no longer be the wife she used to be. Her thoughts kept returning to Josh, to the moment they spent together. Lisa tried to behave as usual, but it was impossible. Every time Mark looked at her, she felt guilt rising inside her. She knew she had betrayed him, but she couldn't do anything about it. A few days passed, and Josh came back to their house. Lisa knew that their relationship would not be the same now. She felt that their bond had become too strong to just ignore it. With each new meeting, there were fewer words between them, and more tacit understanding of what had happened. They both knew they had crossed the line, but neither of them was ready to stop. Lisa felt crushed. She couldn't find the strength to admit to Mark what had happened. Every night when she went to bed next to him, she felt the wall growing between them, which was getting higher every day. Their rare moments of intimacy now seemed empty and meaningless to her. Lisa could no longer feel what she had felt before. Her body and mind now belonged to another person, and it was both a frightening and liberating feeling for her. Her life began to split into two parts. On the one hand, there was Mark, her husband, with whom she had shared many years, and with whom she had common plans for the future. On the other hand, there was Josh, who awakened feelings in her that she had long forgotten about. Lisa didn't know how to deal with this contradiction, but one thing was clear: her life would never be the same again. And every day became a struggle with herself for her. Lisa tried to convince herself that all this would end soon, that she would be able to forget about what had happened and return to her old life. But every day the thought seemed more and more impossible to her. Since Lisa and Josh crossed that invisible line, their lives began to be filled with complex and contradictory emotions that haunted them day and night. Lisa was in a state of constant internal tension, which was growing every day. She felt the reality around her gradually distort. What seemed stable, solid and right began to crumble. And each new day only intensified this feeling. Mark, as always, was busy with work and the problems that surrounded him, and Lisa couldn't stop thinking about Josh. But what worried her even more was that she felt that with each visit he was becoming an increasingly important part of her life. This internal struggle was exhausting her. On the one hand, she tried to convince herself that everything that happened with Josh was a mistake, a weakness caused by temporary difficulties in marriage. But on the other hand, her heart was telling a different story. When Josh was around, her body reacted in a way she hadn't felt for a long time. It awakened life, passion, desire, which had long since died out in her relationship with Mark. These feelings overwhelmed her, but Lisa tried to suppress them, although it became more difficult every day. The feeling that she was changing the brand not only with her body, but also with her soul, tore her apart. She constantly tried to convince herself that this was just a passing infatuation, that everything would get better soon, and she would be able to focus on her marriage again. But as soon as she thought about it, her thoughts went back to Josh, and she realized that nothing would end so easily. Their relationship with Josh became increasingly strained. There was no longer the lightness that existed before, when they could talk for hours about everything in the world without feeling the slightest tension. Now their every interaction was filled with a hidden tension that prevented them from breathing freely. Lisa noticed how Josh began to avoid their meetings, as if he was afraid of what was going on between them. He no longer stayed with them at night as often as before, and if he did, he was reserved and closed all the time. Lisa felt this alienation and could not understand whether it pleased her or, on the contrary, tormented her. On the one hand, she was glad that Josh was trying to keep his distance, because it meant that he realized how dangerous their attraction to each other had become. But on the other hand, it only intensified her inner struggle. She felt like she was losing control of the situation, and it scared her. The time Josh was with her became a source of painful desire and guilt at the same time. The nights were the hardest time for her. Mark, as always, fell asleep instantly, his deep, measured breathing filling the room. But Lisa couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the rhythm of his sleep, and each time it reminded her how far they had become from each other. She no longer felt the connection that once existed between them. Their marriage seemed to her an empty, formal union, devoid of passion and mutual understanding. Every time she looked at Mark, she felt a sense of alienation. She saw before her the man who had once been everything to her, but now they seemed to live in different worlds. One night Lisa couldn't sleep again. She was lying in bed, listening to the soft sounds outside the window, when suddenly she felt that she could no longer be in this state in this room, next to Mark, in this marriage that had become a cage for her. In the darkness of the room, her mental anguish became unbearable. She wanted to scream, to tear apart this invisible net that bound her movements, her thoughts, her feelings. She couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Quietly, trying not to wake Mark, Lisa got out of bed and went out into the hallway. She didn't know what she was going to do, she just wanted to get away from this suffocating feeling. Her footsteps seemed to be too loud in the silence of the house, but Mark did not wake up. Lisa headed into the kitchen, trying to put her thoughts in order, but her anxiety only increased. When she reached the living room where Josh usually slept, her heart stopped for a moment. She knew that he was staying with them that evening, and she knew that she should just go back to the bedroom, to her husband, and go back to bed, pretending that everything was as usual. Instead, she stood on the threshold of the living room, leaning against the door frame. In the darkness of the room, she could barely make out the outline of Josh's figure on the couch. He seemed to be asleep, but Lisa couldn't take her eyes off him. The silence was deafening, as if all the sounds of this world had disappeared. Lisa stood motionless, feeling a sense of disaster growing inside her. She knew that if she took another step, if she got close to him, she wouldn't be able to go back anymore. But at that moment she was mesmerized. She was drawn to him like a magnet, and she could no longer resist this attraction. The inner voice that was trying to keep her from doing anything else died down. Lisa felt her body stop obeying her mind. At that moment, everything she thought was right no longer mattered. All moral principles, all obligations, everything that connected her with her previous life, collapsed. She moved closer to the couch, feeling her breathing become ragged. Her hands were shaking, but she couldn't stop. Lisa slowly knelt down next to the couch, not taking her eyes off Josh. He didn't move, his breathing was even, but she knew he wasn't asleep. There was a heavy silence between them, which was saturated with everything that they were both afraid to say out loud. It was a silence filled with guilt, fear, but also a desire that they could no longer suppress. Lisa sat next to him for a long time, unable to move. Her heart was pounding. It seemed like it was about to jump out of her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: this was the moment when her life would change forever. And this moment was inevitable. When Josh finally opened his eyes, their gazes met, and Lisa realized that their silence said more than any words. Everything that was hidden between them became apparent in an instant. Her body was shaking with tension from what was about to happen. At that moment, she knew that she had crossed the line beyond which there was no way back. This night became a point of no return for them. Their bodies merged together, violating all the rules and obligations that existed before. It wasn't just a physical connection, it was confirmation that their attraction to each other had become too strong to ignore. Lisa allowed herself to be vulnerable, allowed herself to experience feelings that she had suppressed for too long. She couldn't pretend that everything was under control anymore. Now they both knew the truth. There was no friendship between them anymore, only passion mixed with guilt and forbidden desire. After that night, Lisa returned to her bedroom, to Mark. She stared at his sleeping face for a long time, illuminated by the faint light coming through the window. She felt crushed. Her heart was filled with guilt and fear of what would happen next. She knew that she had betrayed him, that she had destroyed everything they had built together, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved. Now she didn't have to pretend anymore. Everything was in its place. She knew who she really wanted all these months. In the days that followed, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that her relationship with Josh was now doomed to repeat itself. Every time she saw him, there was a silence between them, full of tension. They both tried to behave as usual, but it was impossible. Their intimacy had become something much more serious than they could have imagined. Now their relationship was something irreversible, and every day Lisa felt her life becoming more complicated and complicated. This night was not just a mistake or a fleeting weakness. It was the moment when Lisa finally realized that her life would never be the same again. She had feelings with Josh that she hadn't had with Mark in a long time. It was something that destroyed her from the inside, but at the same time made her truly alive. Now Lisa was faced with a choice that scared her to the point of trembling. She didn't know how to live with this knowledge anymore. Her marriage was on the verge of collapse, but she couldn't bring herself to just break up with Mark. Josh became a source of desire and passion for her that she couldn't ignore, but at the same time he became her biggest temptation. After that night, when Lisa first crossed the line between friendship and something deeper with Josh, her life began to fall apart. Outwardly, everything was still the same. Lisa continued to perform her usual duties, Mark came home after work, and Josh occasionally dropped by to visit them. But a chasm opened up inside her, which grew deeper every day and seemed to be filled with guilt and despair more and more. That night was a point of no return for Lisa. She changed everything, even if Mark didn't know it yet. Every morning Lisa woke up with a heavy heart. Mark was still sleeping next to him, his breathing remained even and calm. Nothing seemed to have changed. But Lisa felt like a stranger in her own life, as if she was in constant tension, as if her consciousness was stuck in another reality where she no longer belonged to herself or Mark. She had betrayed her husband, betrayed their past together, and this knowledge tormented her every minute as soon as she opened her eyes. Everything she did seemed artificial to her now. The old ease she had felt with Josh was no longer comforting. There was a hidden awareness in every movement that she had ruined her life. But what tormented her most was not only her guilt about Mark, but also the fact that her feelings for Josh continued to grow. Every time Lisa saw Mark, her heart ached with pain and regret. She knew she had betrayed his trust, but she couldn't bring herself to admit it. It seemed as if an invisible wall had grown up between them, which was getting higher every day. Mark didn't seem to notice what was going on inside her. He still came home tired, lost in his thoughts, and Lisa tried not to show him her inner struggle. They still talked about everyday things, about work, about weekend plans, about household issues, but Lisa could no longer perceive these conversations as something meaningful. Every word she uttered seemed fake to her, as if she was playing a role in a play that had long since lost its meaning. She tried to bring herself back to her usual life, hoping that this feeling of betrayal and guilt would eventually go away. Lisa was doing household chores, spending time with Mark, but every time her thoughts returned to Josh, she felt a wave of fear and desire rise inside her at the same time. These feelings were so strong that she couldn't handle them anymore. There was something unsaid in every look Josh gave her, something that said more than any words, and although they both tried to behave with restraint, Lisa knew that there would no longer be the same friendship between them. She noticed that Josh was starting to come to visit less often. It was strange, but Lisa understood that he also felt the tension that was now hovering between them. Their meetings became less frequent, and every time he appeared, Lisa felt not only joy at seeing him, but also fear that something might happen again that both of them could not control. Her feelings for him did not weaken, but on the contrary, became more and more intense. She felt herself being pulled towards him with such force that she couldn't ignore it anymore. But with each of his visits, her inner guilt only intensified. In every day their communication became more strained. Lisa couldn't look at Josh as just a friend anymore. She knew that their relationship had gone too far, and it depressed her. But despite this, she could not refuse to meet with him. She was drawn to him like a magnet, and every time they were close, there was that tension between them that she could no longer control. They tried to keep their distance, but it became impossible. Lisa felt that her life was splitting into two halves. One part of her soul belonged to Josh, and the other to Mark. But every day this separation became more painful. Lisa began to lose sleep. The nights had become unbearable for her. Every time she went to bed next to Mark, she felt her inner pain only getting worse. She could no longer feel at ease in his presence. Mark still didn't seem to notice what was going on inside her. He was so immersed in his work and worries that he did not notice how their marriage was slowly crumbling. Lisa couldn't look him in the eye. Her soul was torn with guilt. She felt like a traitor, but at the same time she couldn't stop thinking about Josh. One evening, when Mark returned from work late again, Lisa was sitting in the kitchen, lost in her thoughts. She hadn't heard Mark enter the house, and it wasn't until he called out to her that she flinched. Looking at him, she suddenly felt that her heart was no longer beating with the same warmth as before. It was a feeling of emptiness that she couldn't ignore. Lisa understood that her love for Mark had faded, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him about it. Everything they had built together now seemed far away and unimportant to her. She no longer felt the connection that had existed between them in the early years of their marriage. Ever since her relationship with Josh began, Lisa has felt like she was in limbo. Her life became a series of constant doubts and torments. She couldn't figure out what to do next. On the one hand, she didn't want to lose Mark, with whom she had so much in common. They made plans together, went through many difficulties together, and Lisa couldn't just erase those years. But on the other hand, her feelings for Josh had become too strong to ignore. Lisa tried to avoid meeting Josh, but every time she saw him, her heart skipped a beat. Their eyes met, and Lisa felt the same feeling that she had been trying to suppress for so long flare up between them again. She knew that their relationship had gone beyond friendship, and now they were both trapped by their own desires. But the further they went, the more Lisa realized that all this could not go on forever. Mark may have started to suspect something. He became more attentive to her, asking more questions about how she spent the day, what she did, who she saw. Lisa sensed his wariness, but every time she tried to evade the answer. She was tormented by the thought that he might guess. She knew that sooner or later Mark would realize that something had changed between them, but every day she postponed this moment, afraid to ruin everything completely. She couldn't hide her feelings anymore. Lisa understood that her relationship with Mark was becoming more and more strained, and this only increased her inner tension. Every conversation they had, every minute they spent together, seemed empty and meaningless to her. They couldn't talk about their feelings anymore, and every time Mark tried to get close to her, Lisa pulled away. She couldn't bear to pretend that everything was the same, but she didn't know how to admit to him that she had cheated, and she wasn't sure she could handle his reaction. With each passing day, her inner conflict only intensified. Lisa couldn't keep living this lie, but at the same time she was afraid of destroying everything she had with Mark. She knew that she had made a choice in favor of Josh, but she still could not completely break with her previous life. This feeling was tearing at her, making her suffer day after day. On one of these days, Lisa woke up with a feeling that she could no longer continue this game. She knew she had to make a decision, otherwise her life would turn into an endless chain of suffering. Her love for Mark has faded, but she couldn't just give up on their past together. But even more painful was the realization that her attraction to Josh had become so strong that she could no longer live without him. Lisa realized that a serious choice was waiting for her ahead, which would determine her future life. Her inner world turned out to be split between two men, and every day became more and more painful. She couldn't pretend everything was okay anymore. Her marriage to Mark was falling apart before her eyes, and although he did not yet know the whole truth, Lisa understood that this moment was inevitable. Now she had to make the most difficult decision of her life, to choose between the past and the future, between duty and passion. And although Lisa did not know how to deal with this choice, she understood that she could no longer stay in this trap. Her life was on the verge of disaster, and every new day brought her closer to the moment when everything she had been hiding for so long was about to surface. The moment that Lisa had been dreading for so long has finally arrived. She could no longer avoid the truth, hide behind the daily routine, and try to live as if nothing had happened. Her life turned into a real nightmare filled with guilt, fear, and endless doubts. With each passing day, the tension grew like a thickening cloud over her head, ready to burst into a storm at any moment. And she knew it would all be over soon, but the only question was when it would happen, and how. Lisa could no longer find solace in anything. Every day was a painful ordeal. At first she thought she could handle it, go back to her old life, save her marriage, forget about what happened between her and Josh. She was trying to focus on her relationship with Mark again, trying to bring back the feelings that had once been between them. But it turned out to be impossible. Mark had become a stranger to her. His touch only irritated her, and his conversations were like empty chatter, devoid of meaning. There had been a war going on inside her for a long time, but every day she became more helpless in front of her own feelings. Josh has long been more than just a friend. Their relationship went beyond friendship the night they crossed the line for the first time. And although Lisa tried to convince herself that it was a mistake, a weakness, she increasingly realized that her attraction to Josh was not just a temporary infatuation. These were real feelings that she couldn't ignore anymore. After that night, their relationship changed. Josh tried to keep his distance, but every time they were close, there was an irresistible attraction between them that could no longer be hidden. Their looks, gestures, even casual touches, everything reminded them that they had violated the rule, and this could not but leave a mark on their lives. Lisa felt more and more that her inner world was splitting into two parts. On the one hand, she continued to be Mark's wife, to live with him, to share her life with him, but her thoughts and feelings were completely connected with Josh. She couldn't stop herself. Each new meeting with Josh only deepened her inner rift. She could not refuse these meetings, although she understood that they only deepened the gap between her and Mark. Lisa began to avoid talking to her husband, not wanting to face his questions, his perplexity. Mark, in turn, also began to notice the changes. He was no longer that indifferent person who was absorbed in work and career concerns. He felt that Lisa was moving away from him, but he did not know what the reason was. Mark did not immediately begin to suspect that something was wrong. At first he thought that this was an ordinary crisis in a relationship that could be overcome. He tried to establish communication with Lisa, asked questions about her days, and was interested in her mood. But Lisa avoided these conversations every time. Her heart had not belonged to him for a long time, and she could not bear to pretend that everything was the same. It became unbearable for her every time she looked at Mark. She saw not the man she had once loved, but the man she had betrayed. And this feeling tormented her. One morning, when Mark got ready for work, Lisa realized that she couldn't pull any more. She was sitting in the kitchen, looking out the window at the empty street, and felt something break inside her. It was the moment when she realized that everything she had been trying to hide for so long had to come out. She was no longer satisfied with this double life, this constant feeling of guilt that was eating away at her from the inside. Lisa realized that she couldn't pretend anymore. At that moment, she made the decision to tell Mark the truth. The whole day passed in agonizing anticipation. Lisa did not know exactly how she would tell her husband about her infidelity. She imagined his reaction: anger, disappointment, tears. She knew it would destroy him. And the thought was killing her from the inside out, but she also understood that there was no other life anymore. From the moment she found herself in bed with Josh, her life changed forever. It was impossible to return to the old relationship with Mark. She couldn't love him the way she used to. When Mark returned home, Lisa could no longer hide her nervousness. She was sitting on the couch, clutching a mug of cold tea in her hands, and watched him enter the house. Everything seemed familiar that evening. He took off his coat, put his briefcase by the door, and approached her with a smile on his face. But Lisa knew that this habit was about to collapse. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was afraid Mark would hear it. She couldn't put this conversation off any longer. After dinner, when Mark sat next to her on the couch, Lisa felt a wave of fear wash over her. She didn't know where to start, didn't know how to find the words that wouldn't destroy everything at once. But she had no other choice. She knew this conversation had to happen, that she couldn't lie to Mark anymore. It was necessary, no matter how painful it was. When Lisa started to speak, her voice was trembling. Every word was hard to come by. She tried to explain what had happened, how her feelings for Mark had changed, how she began to feel lonely in their marriage. She did not blame him, but she could not say that she was not to blame herself. There were no excuses in her story, only the truth, which was destroying their marriage more and more by the second. She talked about everything, about her feelings for Josh, about what happened between them. Mark listened to her in silence. His face gradually turned pale, and his eyes went out. He didn't interrupt her, didn't ask any questions. Lisa couldn't understand what was going on inside him, but she could see that he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. When she finished speaking, there was silence in the room. Lisa waited for his reaction, shouting, reproaches, tears. But none of this followed. Mark just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if his world had collapsed in an instant. After a long silence, he got up from the sofa and went into the bedroom. Lisa did not follow him. She knew that this moment was the end of their marriage. They couldn't be together anymore. She knew that she had destroyed everything they had built together for so many years. Her heart was bursting with pain, but at the same time she felt strangely relieved. Now everything was open, and she no longer had to pretend. The next morning, Mark packed his things. He didn't say a word. His face was impassive, but Lisa could see in his eyes the hurricane of emotions that was raging inside him. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask for explanations. He just left, closing the door behind him, leaving Lisa alone in their empty house. She knew this moment would come, but she didn't think it would be so painful. After Mark left, Lisa sat in silence for a long time. The house they had built together now seemed empty and gloomy to her. She felt like her inner world had fallen apart, and now she had to put it back together piece by piece. Her marriage to Mark ended, and with it ended most of the life she had known. Lisa realized that now she had to start all over again, but did not know how to do it. Josh, after learning about what Lisa had told Mark, also began to distance himself. Their relationship, which began as something romantic and passionate, has now become a source of pain and suffering. Josh didn't want to be the reason for the destruction of her marriage, and that realization weighed on him. He began to appear less frequently in her life, and soon Lisa realized that she had lost not only her husband, but also Josh. Now she was alone. Lisa couldn't believe for a long time that it was over. Her life had turned into a void, and she didn't know how to fill that void. She had lost two men who were important to her, and now loneliness awaited her. But at the same time, she understood that it was her choice, her decision, and now she had to accept the consequences. Lisa realized that her life would never be the same. Now she was on the threshold of a new stage, but she did not know what it would be like. She had to go through pain and suffering to find herself again. But she was ready for this. Now that it was over, she could start building her life anew without lying and self-deception.